and gentlemen. My name is Brad Rogers and I'm the President of the Economic Society of Australia in the Australian Capital Territory. And I'd just like to do a few introduction remarks this morning just about the Economic Society and how it's been going. The Economic Society started in 1925, which is coming up to 100 years. And over that time, we've seen an incredible transition. And I think one of the great transitions, of course, is the development of the Women Economic Society Network. And so this has just accelerated the expansion of economics profession in Australia, I think, and the recognition of a huge percentage of the important thinkers out there. So I think this conference and the work being done by the wonderful women economics people is awesome. So some of the benefits I think people should be aware of joining the Economic Society is expanding your knowledge about the wider areas of economics. If you're in academia, talking to people outside of academia, if you're in some areas that don't touch academia, you get to update your academic knowledge of different parts of economics, and that really enhances our abilities to provide the best advice to decision makers out there. It also creates networks like the WAN and other networks that are so important to actioning good economic policy in the country, and it helps younger or more junior economists learn from senior economists of just how to progress their thought leadership and to achieve better outcomes for policy and for economic thought. Of course, the main way that we project our thought is through the events, and I think this conference is similar to the national conference. The next national conference is in Tasmania, and I think that'll be great for people to attend, and hopefully we can do it in person by that time. And then the ACT, we're holding the next big event we're trying to hold is at Parliament House, and it's later in the year, and it's been delayed a few times, of course, because of COVID, but it should be a great event. So I think we're being sponsored by the Commonwealth Bank, and we need to sort of promote that along, because it's awesome to connect the banking industry and Parliament House with some leading economic thinkers. And so I suggest that everybody have a look and come along to events and join the society, because you'll get to see awesome speakers like we're going to have today. And so I'm just going to pass now to Maria to do an introduction to the main speaker today. So thanks very much, Maria.
Okay, my name is Maria Racionero. I am Associate Professor at the Research School of Economics at the Australian National University, and also a member of the ACT Branch Committee of the Women Economics Network. I join you today from Canberra in Ngunnawal country, and I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands I stand, and pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce our keynote speaker today, Nuria Rodriguez-Planas, Professor of Economics at City University of New York, Queens College, and Research Scholar at Columbia University, Barnard College. We very much thank Nuria for accepting the invitation to deliver the keynote address today. I understand that she joins us from New York today after a relatively long day of teaching. Nuria has in fact been a fantastic contributor to the workshop this year. She also delivered a short course on women's labor market, institutions and social norms on Wednesday. Well done, Nuria. Nuria's research focuses on highly policy relevant topics and uses a wide range of quantitative methods. One of her current lines of research explores the link between gender norms and behavior. One of her important contributions in this area has been to show empirically that gender norms impact not only women's, but also men's behavior as societies become less traditional and traditional norms are relaxed both for men and women. By using alternative identification strategies and data sources, it has strengthened the empirical evidence on the relevance of social norms and broadened the understanding of factors behind cognitive development, engagement in risky behaviors, and intimate partner violence, hopefully paving the way for policies in these areas. Nuria was also among the first to estimate event studies around the birth of the first child and explain a sizable proportion of the motherhood earnings gap between first-time mothers and childless women. And in a separate important contribution, she has shown that a well-intended policy that sought to allow parents with young children to reduce their working hours contributed to worsen rather than improve labor market inequalities between men and women due to the gendered nature of the take-up, with only women requesting part-time work. So given the breadth and strength of her contributions in the area, I am very much looking forward to her keynote address on gender gaps and social norms today. And I would like to thank the sponsors, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute, and the Commonwealth Treasury for the opportunity to be able to listen to her. Nuria will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and there will be about 15 minutes for Q&A following her talk. I remind you that you can send through your questions via the Q&A box. You can also upvote your favorite questions so that I can identify the most popular ones most quickly during the Q&A. So off now to Nuria.
Thank you so much, Maria. I'm very excited to be here and honored to have been invited to be one of the keynote speakers. I also wanted to thank Kristen Sobek. She's been a great host, and also Brad Rogers and of course the sponsors. So thank you so much. Let me share the screen. I'll present my work on social norms and gender gaps. So men's and women's lives have converged considerably in the past century, both in the United States and in many developed countries. In fact, gender gaps have not only decreased, but sometimes reversed in different areas. Education, for instance, a lot of times it has reversed. Labor force participation, wages, risky behaviors. And one of the possible explanations for these conversions is the evolution of gender roles and expectations. So in traditional societies, men and women had very clear and distinct expectations. And here I'm going to quote Snitman, where women in traditional societies were traditionally thought of as generally weak, careful, obedient, socially responsible and sensible, well-behaved and anxious about and responsive to others' opinions. Whereas men were considered independent, daring, and fearless, inherently curious, and holders of relaxed attitudes. So because societies had these different expectations for men and women, they also had different roles, behavioral roles for men and women. And in particular, women were considered responsible of the child rearing, caretaking, and domestic tasks. And men were the breadwinners, hard workers, independent thinkers, and those who are strong and willing to take risks. So in those traditional societies, it is very costly to deviate from the expectations and behavioral roles set for men and women. And it's costly for both men and women. And this is so because either women and men have internally absorbed and accepted those roles, and therefore deviating from them is costly, or maybe they don't agree with those roles, but then society is going to punish them if they try to deviate from them. However, as societies relax, become less traditional, and gender stereotypes relax, we should expect to observe that women engage more and more in traditionally male activities, in that men engage more and more in female activities, and therefore the convergence. The problem is that it's very difficult to causally test whether gender roles and expectations impact differentially the behavior of men and women. And there's at least two empirical challenges. One is how to achieve causal identification, and the other one is how to measure the key variable, the key explanatory variable, traditional gender norms. So I'm going to start talking about the second challenge, how to measure it. In one, the easiest way is to just directly measure gender norms. And one can do that because there's a lot of surveys that ask individuals whether they agree with statements such as being a housewife is just as fulfilling as working for pay. Or when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than a woman. So using these surveys, one can tabulate the share of a population that agrees or disagrees with these statements. And there's quite some researchers that have done that and have looked at whether these shares correlate with, for instance, women labor force participation or unequal ratios in favor of boys being good at math or girls being good at reading. And for instance, Nicole Fortin has a very nice paper where she looks at this variation across OECD countries. And she finds, for instance, in the left-hand figure, you can see that as countries, as there's a higher share of women that agree with scarce jobs should go to men, the female labor force participation decreases. And the similar result occurs in the figure on the right-hand side. Pope and Sibner instead exploit variation across regions in the United States, and they find that in those regions where there's a higher proportion of the population that agree that women are better suited for home, for instance, in South and South Central region, there's a higher adherence with the stereotype adherence index. Okay, the problem with this analysis is that basically they're capturing correlations. They're not capturing causal estimates. So there might be confounding characteristics, institutions, or things in those regions or those countries that are correlated with female labor force participation and that have nothing to do with gender roles. Or on the other hand, there might be reverse causation. So it might be that in those regions or countries where there's a higher female labor force participation, women have more empowerment, and that kind of leads to changes in institutions, but also in the norms of that region or country. And then finally, it's not clear whether what they're capturing is really institutions or culture or both. So one way to address these is to use what is well known as the epidemiologic approach. And basically, this focuses on second-generation immigrants. These are individuals that were born in the country their parents immigrated to, but they come from, so basically, they're totally assimilated because they have always lived in the same country, and they share the host country of their parents, labor markets, regulations, laws, institutions, educational system. However, they're influenced by different cultural beliefs, which are the beliefs of their parents or their parents' peers, which come from the country of ancestry. And the idea here is like, if we find a correlation between outcomes in the host country of second-generation immigrants and the same outcomes measured in the country of ancestry, then it has to be some kind of transmission, intergenerational transmission from the parents who were immigrants to the kids who are born in the host country, for instance, Australia, through the beliefs, the culture. And that's kind of evidence that culture matters and that gender norms have been transmitted. So I have a paper with Libertad Gonzalez where we look at whether there is gender norms matter in terms of, with intimate partner violence. So the objective is to study whether traditional gender norms, culture, are relevant in explaining the incidence and intensity of intimate partner violence. But why would that be? Why would having beliefs that are more or less traditional affect the likelihood that a woman becomes a victim of domestic violence? So first, there's a lot of evidence showing at the micro level that men are more likely to sexually assault women or practice marital violence if they identify with traditional images of masculinity and privilege. At the community or aggregate level, there's also evidence showing that men's use of violence against women is correlated with patriarchal and hyper-masculine ideology. In patriarchal societies, usually men and women have very distinct roles, and those roles put women in a situation more vulnerable because she has less economic resources, and therefore she's going to be less likely to adopt economic or social sanctions against potentially abusive husbands, or be able to leave an abusive relationship. At the same time, in societies where violence against women is common, or where a substantial proportion of the population condones abuse, women's risk of experiencing, accepting, or rationalizing intimate partner violence may be higher. So as societies change and women get more educated and leave the household, and men and women converge both in investment in human capital, employment, and wages, women are going to become more empowered, the gender roles are going to evolve, and hegemonic masculine norms are going to be challenged, and therefore different forms of masculinity emerge, making communities and individuals less likely to internalize social norms that justify abuse. So we're not the first to look at culture and IPV. There's 3 papers that I cite here are also doing that at different levels. And for the sake of brevity, I'm going to kind of move on and not explain them, but I did want to acknowledge them. So our contribution is to show that women from more gender equal countries of ancestries are less likely to be victims of intimate partner violence than those from more traditional societies. And it's important to note that because we're looking at correlates between the country of ancestry and where the women live currently, the simultaneity bias that was often seen in the previous data that I showed you is very difficult, but because it's hard to visualize how women who live in a host country are going to be influencing intimate partner violence in the country of ancestry of the parents. It's clear that the causality, if anything, has to go from the country of ancestry of the parents, culture, to women's incidence of violence in the country of where they live. So what about institutions? Our research does not say that institutions are not important. Our research just says that it's silence about institutions. We're just talking about culture. Clearly, culture and institutions are very intertwined, but a lot of the research that I present aims at identifying just culture, holding constant institution, and we make a big effort to do that. So I'm going to be very quick here. Let me just show you the graph. Well, I think, yeah. So how do we measure intimate partner violence? So we have this survey from the European Union, the 2012 European Union. We're going to have 3,500 first and second generation immigrants from 41 different countries of ancestries living in 28 European countries. And the explanatory variable is going to be country of ancestry measures, in particular the gender gap index from the World Economic Forum. This is an index that is basically composed of 4 different indices measuring the situation of women in a particular country. And the 4 indices measure convergence in economic participation and opportunity, in educational attainment, in political empowerment, and health and survival. So that's kind of our measure of culture in the country of ancestry. We have this survey asks about being victim of intimate physical violence in the previous 12 months and violence produced by a current or previous partner. And you can see here the type of questions that are asked. And then basically we're going to create 3 outcomes: a binary outcome, were you victim? Yes, no. And 5% of our sample was victim of intimate partner violence in the last 12 months. And then 2 measures of intensity that basically capture how much of physical violence you receive, either by type or by counts. So basically, the main specification is going to be on the left-hand side, the outcome variable measuring intimate partner violence, and we're going to regress it with the GGI, the gender equality measure in the country of ancestry. So we exploit variation across country of ancestry in the level of intimate partner violence, and we see whether that's associated with being a victim of intimate partner violence in the country where you reside. Of course, we control for a lot of individual characteristics, including spouses characteristics, and a lot of characteristics of the country of ancestry, measuring different institutions, education, level of development, levels of inequality, to make sure that what we're capturing is the effect of this differential gender empowerment in the country of ancestry versus different institutions in the country of ancestry. And basically, our variable coefficient of interest is going to be alpha 1, which captures the association between gender gaps in the country of ancestry and experience of IPV in the host country. So if alpha 1 is negative, it means that, so the GGI usually goes from 0 to 1, 1 being more gender equal. If alpha 1 is negative, it means that as the woman comes from a country that is more gender equal, her likelihood of being victim of intimate partner violence in the host country decreases. And basically, this is what we find. So this is I'm going to show you 3 graphs with different, so basically on the left-hand side is the different level of gender equality in the country of ancestry of these women. On the axis, on the y-axis, we see the average incidence of intimate partner violence. And what we find is that if you come from a country that's more gender equal, you're much less likely to be victim of violence, domestic violence, than if you come from a country where there's less gender equality, that is less gender equal. And the same here. So coming from a country of ancestry that is more gender equal decreases your likelihood that in the country where you reside, you're going to be a victim of intimate partner violence. And this is regardless of what measure. So how much does this represent? Well, basically, this is kind of equivalent to 1/3 of the effect of having children on intimate partner violence. So we measured what is the effect of having a child on the likelihood that you're victim of partner violence, and we compared the 2 effects, and we find that culture, the way we measure it, is as large of an effect as the effect of having children on the likelihood of being a victim of partner violence. So now, this is very nice, but you might say, well, there still might be confounding effects. There might still be a lot of other things from the country of ancestry that the econometrician cannot observe, and that have nothing to do with gender norms that you may be picking up and might be explaining this association. And so the next way to address this is to, instead of looking at the association between measures of outcomes in the country of ancestry and female outcomes, we're going to look at both men and women. And here, basically, we're doing like a difference analysis, because now we're going to look at whether the outcomes vary between men and women who come from the same country of ancestry, and we're going to be comparing them to the similar outcomes for men and women who come from another country of ancestry that is less gender equal. So let me now, I want to talk about the paper that we have on the math gender gap, and this is with Natalia Nollenberger and Almudena Sevilla. And basically, in this paper, what we show is that the gender gap in math, so basically, there's a kind of stylized fact that is found that usually girls tend to underperform in math test scores starting middle school, and that persists over time relative to boys. And what we looked at is how much of this gender gap in math, this underperformance of girls relative to boys, is explained by gender norms. So there was earlier work that showed that the gender gap in math was correlated with gender equality and norms regarding women's role in society. However, these papers were just looking at correlation. And what we do is, using the epidemiological approach, we're going to look at what is the effect of culture on the math gender gap. So how do we do it? We're going to use PISA data from 2003, 2006, 2009, and 2012. And our outcome here is going to be the test score, a standardized mathematics assessment administered to 15-year-olds in schools across OECD countries. In this case, our sample is going to be close to 12,000 second-generation immigrants. So these are individuals that were born in the country where their parents immigrated, but they were born in that country. So they speak perfectly well the country, the language, they went to those schools, they have not necessarily any assimilation problem because they were born in that host country. In our case, in this paper, they come from 35 different countries of ancestry. And basically, so the identification strategy is using different levels of gender equality from these 35 different countries of ancestry. But now, instead of just comparing the outcome like we did before in the previous paper, we were comparing the outcome of intimate partner violence of women coming from more or less gender equal countries of ancestry. Now we're going to compare the math performance of girls relative to boys who come from the same country of ancestry and who might be very gender equal, relative to the performance of girls relative to boys who come from countries of ancestries that are less gender equal. So it's going to be a diff and diff. And by looking at this gender gap, we're holding constant everything that doesn't have to do with gender from the country of ancestry. So the basic result is kind of very well portrayed with this graph. So again, we have different countries. The X indicates the gender gap from the country of ancestry, whereas a higher number means that the country is much more gender equal. So New Zealand's doing very well, Australia is doing quite well. And what we see is on the y-axis, the math gender gap. And you can see that overall, the math gender gap tends to be negative, although in New Zealand, it's pretty much a bit positive, right, or zero. In Australia, it's positive. Girls overperform boys in math, in PISA data, in our PISA data. And basically what we see is that the gender gap in math declines and converges towards zero, basically disappears as we move from less gender equal to more gender equal society. Yeah, so this is kind of the specification. Yeah, so basically this specification is identical to the previous one. So we have the outcome, in this case, it's going to be math test scores. We have the GGI. In here, we don't have the GGI because we have a country of ancestry fixed effects. That's basically going to control for not only gender inequality, not only the level of development, the educational level of the country, the potential inequalities, and any other institution. So basically, the GGI is going to be, and here it's going to absorb also the GGI. So the GGI, we're going to basically add to the previous specification a female dummy that's going to capture the difference between man and woman in the outcome. So here in the math gender, in the test scores in math. And we're going to interact it with all the variables and the fixed effects. And our interest, coefficient of interest is going to be alpha 2, which is the GGI interacted with the female. And that's basically what was being plotted here. So here you can see, as a result, you can see that girls underperform overall relative to boys in math test scores. The second equation is the one where we are looking at the relationship with the gender equality measures in the country of ancestry, interacted with a female after controlling for most of, a lot of the things you're supposed to control for and a lot of the fixed effects. And basically what we see is that although girls underperform in math relative to boys, the relationship between gender equality in the country of ancestry and the female dummy is positive, indicating that girls that come from countries of ancestry that are more gender equal relative to boys who come from the same country of ancestry are much more likely to perform better than girls who come from countries of ancestry that are less gender equal relative to those boys who come from the same less gender equal countries. Okay, so pretty much that's kind of the result. So in that paper, we showed that gender matter, and it mattered to explain the gender gap in mathematics. But the next question is like, well, but you know, parents' gender norms affect girls' math performance relative to boys. So the next question is like, but why is that? How much of the girls' relative decline in math test performance is explained by math-specific gender stereotypes versus general gender-specific gender stereotypes? So what do I mean? So we find that culture explains part of the math gender gap. And what we don't know if it's that girls underperform because they've been told by their parents or their parents' peers that girls are not good, you know, that math is for boys, reading is for girls, or boys are good at math and girls are good at writing, or it is always men who work at science, engineering, and technical fields. Men are the doctors, the engineers, not girls. So that would be math-specific gender stereotypes. So our question now is, how much of this relationship is explained by math-specific gender stereotypes versus general gender stereotypes? General gender stereotypes is that, you know, the best woman is a stay-at-home mom. Women are supposed to make less money than men. Women are not politicians. Girls have to work hard to learn in school, whereas boys are naturally gifted. Women are nurses, not doctors. So that's kind of more telling them. So that's the question. So how much of the result that we find of culture explaining the math gender gap in OECD countries is explained by math-specific gender stereotypes versus general gender stereotypes? And we address this in this paper that's called Let the Girls Learn. It's not only about math, it's about gender social norms. So you pretty much have the answer that I wrote with Natalia Nollenberger. So basically, in this paper, we show that the relationship between the math gender gap and culture is not driven by gender math-specific norms, but rather by general gender stereotypes about girls, boys, and educational outcomes. So the way we do this is we're going to basically present different types of evidence, okay? So the first evidence we're going to present is we're going to ask how much of that, so does culture only impact math and the gender gap in math between boys and girls, or does it also impact the gender gap in reading, where girls outperform boys, or the gender gap in science? So that's the first question. If it only affects the gender gap in math, but it doesn't affect the gender gap in reading and science, then maybe that's evidence in favor of math-specific gender stereotypes. So what we did is we replicated the analysis, but this time the outcome variable is going to be reading test scores, or the second time it's going to be science test scores. And basically the result is the same. So culture also explains the gender gap, so basically coming from more gender equal societies implies that girls are going to overperform relative to boys than if they come from less gender equal societies, okay? So that's kind of one of the results. And the same thing for science. So basically, this is kind of in favor that this result is not field specific to math, it holds across different fields. The second thing that we did was, okay, so we have culture, and culture is an index that I already told you is composed of four different indices. One on educational, another one on political empowerment, health and survival, and economic participation. And what we ask is, how much of these norms are explained by each of these different components? If it's math-specific gender stereotypes, we would expect that the educational attainment, the culture related to educational beliefs would matter a lot. If it's the other ones, in particular economic participation or political empowerment, then we're going to expect that it's probably less specific to math and more general. And that's pretty much what we find. So these are the different specifications with different measures of political female empowerment. And what we find that matters is political empowerment and economic empowerment. Education and health does not matter that much. So another point in favor of general stereotypes versus math-specific stereotypes. Then what we also ask is how much of this is driven by different types of beliefs related to girls' anxiety, on performing math, preferences, whether they like or dislike math, or whether their beliefs of the role of women in society regarding math ability. And when we do that, so basically we see that girls are so this is the basic result, girls underperform boys in math, but they're also more likely to think that they're not good at math, they're less efficient at math, they're less likely to be useful to do math because of professional careers, their professional prospects. They have much more anxiety than boys in math and have less interest in math. However, when we look at the interaction with GGI and female, what we find is that there's a clear positive relationship with gender equality in the country of ancestry and liking math. So basically, we find that girls whose parents come from more gender equal countries just like math more. So again, it seems that it's parents instilling girls' preferences for math versus other things. And then the last thing that we did, and I'm going to go very quickly on this, is we tested how much of this result is driven by cognitive versus non-cognitive skills. And basically the way we did that is the PISA test scores, the PISA exams change the order of the questions, and some questions are more difficult than others. And also the order, like as the test goes by, the attention of the kids decreases. So we can identify the non-cognitive skill on how much attention the kid is doing given the difficulty of the question. And basically, I'm not going to provide the results, but the bottom line is we don't find any evidence that cognitive skills are a key factor, non-cognitive skills. It's all driven by cognitive skills. So basically what we find in this paper is that gender norms seem to be affecting how much parents push their daughters to learn cognitive skills relative to boys, any type of cognitive skill. Math, science, reading. Without affecting, but because we don't find anything on non-cognitive skills, it's not that parents don't care about their daughters, they care about their non-cognitive skills, but they don't think that their cognitive skills are as important. So that's kind of basically the bottom result. So now there's another paper that just came out of the oven. This is with Maddalena Davoli. And here we ask the same question, does culture matter? But in terms of financial literacy. So again, there's a gender gap in financial literacy where girls and women are much less likely to be financially literate than men. And we ask again the same question, do we find a correlation between gender equality or the level of literacy in the country of ancestry and how well women are, how literate women are, their knowledge in financial literacy relative to men who come from the same country of ancestry. And again, we find the same result. This is with the United States. And our measure of country of ancestry is really a measure of country of ancestry. This is not second generation immigrants. This is our US citizens who are asked, which was your country of ancestry? And what we find is that the gender gap in knowledge in financial literacy, which is negative, women underperform men in financial literacy, decreases and converges to zero as we move from, as we compare men and women from countries of ancestry where there's less of a gender gap in financial literacy in the country of ancestry, where there's less of inequality. Okay, so let me, so what's nice about looking at gender gaps in culture is that in terms of methodology, in terms of identification strategy, we're doing a diff and diff. And by doing a diff and diff, we're kind of netting out a lot of the confounding effects that one may worry with identification. However, there's another very nice thing about it, which is that we find out about men and how gender norms impact men, right? The previous wave of studies that was only looking at women, female labor force participation, intimate partner violence, fertility, and culture only speaks for women. And actually, excuse me, a lot of that literature used men as a falsification test, saying, oh, we don't find that culture affects male labor force participation. But of course it doesn't, because most men are working all the time. So there's not much variation. It's not kind of like what one would expect. What's nice about this is not just that we can identify better, our identification strategy is cleaner, but is that now we can speak about how greater gender equality impacts not only women, but also men. So basically, what are the results? Well, we find that greater gender equality in the country of ancestry. So if you're influenced by gender norms that are less traditional, you're going to, the test performance of both boys and girls improves. So it's not only girls that win, but it's also boys. And that's also true for reading and science. What we find is that the improvement is larger for girls than for boys, but we also find that boys benefit from being influenced or living in communities that are less gender traditional. Allen and Newman have a very nice paper where they find that boys are much more likely to enter female-dominated fields and vice versa if they live in societies that are less traditional. And in this case, identification even comes from comparing boys and girls within the same household. So convergence of gender identity norms seems to be beneficial for all in terms of, it reduces domestic violence and it improves educational cognitive skills. And also it converges in, there's convergence in the labor force and in wages. So the question is like, is it always good? Does having less traditional norms, is it always something good? And I'm kind of thinking, well, should we push for that in terms of policy, right? Well, what we find, and I'm going to talk about this in the next paper that I present, we find that being influenced by less traditional gender norms is going to imply that there's convergence in gender in risky behaviors. Traditionally, men are much more likely to engage in risky behaviors, drinking and smoking and violence than women and fighting. And what we find is that as women transition from more traditional societies to less traditional societies, they're also likely to be converging in risky behaviors, which are not necessarily good and have definitely public health consequences. So we find that relaxing traditional gender norms increases teenage girls' engagement in risky behaviors during high school in Spain. And here, the paper that was eventually published is only with smoking, but the work was done not just with smoking, but with getting drunk regularly, marijuana use of other illegal drugs, and being expelled from school. And we replicate these results using a completely different data set from the United States, the AGEW, and using also the epidemiological approach. So this is the paper with Ana Santigaldeano, intergenerational transmission of gender, social norms, and teenage smoking. I'm going to skip all the motivation on why gender norms would affect smoking, but it's in the paper and I'm happy to discuss it later. I just want to show you kind of the graph. So again, what do we find? We find, so these are high school girls and boys. We look at the gender gap, the female to male ratio in smoking relative to the country of ancestry. GGI, the gender equality measures. So these are second generation immigrants, boys and girls living in Spain. And what we find is that if they come from more gender equal societies, girls are much more likely to smoke relative to boys than if they come from less gender equal societies, right? So coming from Sweden, which is a non-traditional society, implies that girls are in Spain, whose parents come from Sweden, are much more likely to smoke relative to boys from Sweden, relative to girls and relative to boys from Morocco. Okay, so kind of, again, why would we find this correlation between the gender equality in the country of ancestry of the parents and the smoking likelihood between boys and girls in Spain, boys and girls who were born in Spain, because the beliefs from the parents have been transmitted from one society to the other. And here it's the same exercise, but instead of gender equality, we have the female to male smoking ratio in the country of ancestry. So I have, about 5 more minutes, and then I don't want to talk. I want to take questions. So the next question is like, okay, so hopefully you see that there's enough evidence at this point, kind of piling up with very different outcomes, not only about women, but also about the gender gap in different outcomes using a variety of countries, kind of showing that there seems to be a very strong association between gender inequality or gender norms or gender equality or gender empowerment in the country of ancestry and behavior of men relative to women in the host country, in the country where their parents immigrated, right? So I think that internal validity needs to be set up. The big question is, what about external validity? And the reason, so in some ways you can say, well, you've done it with many outcomes, you've done it in many countries, so there is external validity. And that's true. However, this analysis relies on second generation immigrants, right? So, and second generation immigrants are not necessarily the same than the average population, those who have been immigrants for many, 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 many generations, right? So the solution, so it's not clear that these results would expand beyond the second generation. So one way to kind of address this is to use a completely alternative identification. Also, for instance, Japan is a country that does not have that many immigrants, so one cannot do this type of analysis with Japan, right? So the alternative is to do a very different identification strategy, and I'm showing 4 different papers here. The first 2, so basically these papers are using the same identification strategy, which is the peers effect. However, the first 2 are much cleaner because they focus on peers within a high school, right? So the identification strategy here is going to be comparing the behavior of high school kids, in particular in this paper, boys and girls who are in the same high school, but have different peers. And they have different peers because they were born at different ages, they were in different cohorts, or in different grades. That's it, pretty much it. So that's kind of what the identification strategy is. 2 sets of papers. In these ones, the identification strategy is the same, but it's more of a stretch because instead of comparing different cohorts within the same high school, we're comparing different cohorts with different cohorts and different education levels within, one country across different regions, right? And you might be thinking, well, it's not clear that the identification is as clear. So let me very briefly tell you about this paper with Ana Sanz-de-Galdeano and Anastasia Terskaya. This is gender norms in high schools, the impact of risky behaviors from adolescence to adulthood. And basically, the way we measure gender norms here, non-traditional gender norms, is we have information on the mother's beliefs on which skills are more relevant for both boys and girls to possess. And basically, what we say is that, so this can be traditionally masculine skills, so to think for yourself, to work hard, or traditionally female skills, such as being well-behaved, popular, or help others. So we're going to classify non-traditional mothers as those who responded that traditionally masculine skills are most relevant for either a boy or a girl. So if they say what's more important is either for a girl or boy, regardless of I have a daughter or a son, to work hard and think for himself or herself, I'm going to classify this as a non-traditional mother. And basically what we look at is the relationship between, the proportion of non-traditional mothers in my grade, in my school, and my behavior in terms of engaging in risky behavior in school. And then we look at over time. And when we calculate the proportion of traditional mothers, of course, we do not include my own mother, right? So basically what we find is that so having less traditional mothers in one's cohort in high school reduces the gap in risky behaviors in high school. So we find that there's gender convergence in engagement in risky behaviors. And this is driven because boys are less likely to engage in risky behaviors if in their grade, the proportion of mothers that are non-traditional is much higher. And we find that this result holds and persists, up to the 20s, and then disappears. And then what we did also is say, well, and in fact, what we find is that girls who are in cohorts with less traditional mothers are more likely to engage in risky behaviors relative to boys. So it's kind of that gender gap. They kind of are more likely to have more traditional gender. Okay, and then, and I'm finishing up here because I'm running out of time. The next question is, well, if this is really driven by traditional gender norms, when these kids are 24 years old, out of high school, do we still find that having had less traditional gender mothers as a cohort in high school impacts female labor force participation, wages, or welfare receipts? And we find that it does. So we find that there's a convergence in gender in labor market outcomes, whereas that convergence is driven by those women who, when they were growing up in their high school, there was a higher share of less traditional mothers in their grade. And it's all driven by girls being more likely to earn more and being less likely to be welfare recipients. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. I'm going to skip the last paper. And I'm going to, this is kind of my last slide. So is relaxing gender norms good or bad for women? So it's clear that it's very good for women and for men in terms of convergence in the labor market and outcomes in the labor market for women, for wages, for employment, education, financial literacy, and domestic violence. It's good for women. We know that it's also good for men in a lot of these dimensions. However, we do observe a greater engagement of women in risky behaviors, although we also observe a decrease in men engaging in risky behaviors if they come from societies that are, or in communities that are more traditional, less traditional. So what are the next steps? The next steps are to better understand how institutions interact with gender norms. Do institutions help attenuate those gender norms or increase their effect? And what are the optimal institutions to reduce the gender? And I'll stop. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nuria, for an enlightening presentation full of clever ideas of how to identify the effects, but also opening questions of how to continue with this line of research. Very fascinating. We have a few questions, and I have been trying to keep track of to which of the papers that you presented it referred. So the first question referred to the math paper, that the second one that you presented. So the question says, for the math scores paper, how do you control for the heterogeneity in schools in very large host and ancestry countries? For example, there is an average gender norm across the US, but arguably the Northeast is more progressive than the South. I guess this doesn't matter if the same amount of boys and girls are geographically settling in host countries in similar proportions. I don't know if you have looked into this.
Okay, so we use that. So in those two papers, we use the PISA data set. If PISA gives us the region of the school, we control for that, right? So we have region fixed effects if that is available in the country. In Spain, we have it. In other countries, we don't have it. So that, that would take care of that. And I think we interact that with the female dummy. So that would take care of, kind of specific pattern differential between boys and girls or men and women, that any kind of institutional difference. But the other thing is PISA, basically these tests are done in a particular school, and everybody who's there in that day takes it, both boys and girls. So by default, we have, boys and girls from the same school. So the problem that, I don't think we're going to have an imbalance in gender of more boys from one versus another, because most schools are co-educational, and we're going to have both boys and girls in the same school. But unfortunately, we cannot control for school fixed effects, right? So that's kind of ideal. We cannot do that with PISA data. We could do it with a different data set, but not with PISA data.
Okay, well, thank you. The next question, I think, refer to the paper Let the Girls Learn, the third paper that you discussed. And it says, if political representation influences gender norms, if I've understood well the paper, what are your thoughts about gender quotas on boards, parliament, and other such policies?
Right, so what we find is not that political representation. So what we find is that gender empowerment in political institutions and in the economic empowerment in the country of ancestry are the key factors correlated with performance in the host country of girls relative to boys. So that clearly is telling us that what matters if we want more gender equality is more more female empowerment, both in the labor market and in the political environment. So yes, that would speak toward more, quotas for women. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. I have a third question. There might be other ones. Please feel free to, yes, I think, I have more, yes. So a third question referred to the paper, the first paper on the risky behavior that you discussed, the first one with Ana Sanz-de-Galdeano.
Okay.
And it says, could slide 75, Australia, very low, be indicative of a strong policies, institutions against smoking, because it's very strong policies against smoking here in Australia. Okay. I appreciate that your study looks just at culture, but you will have some outliers, for example, higher GGI and not higher smoking. So, well, I think you at the end you also refer about the next step being better understand how institutions interact with social norms, but I don't know if you have anything to say about this.
So basically, I'm reading the question. So slide 75, Australia is very low. They have, okay.
It's low smoking.
Low smoking, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's two things that I want to clarify that I think are important. Our work is silent about institutions. It doesn't say institutions do not matter. And actually, I have a very long line of research kind of evaluating institutions. And I know that institutions matter. Okay, so it's not that we don't claim, it's just that we can't say anything. Our work doesn't say anything about institutions. And in fact, our work on gender gaps holds constant the institution at the host country and at the country of ancestry, which is something that was a bit harder to do when you're just looking at the outcomes for women. Because then you have to, basically control for a lot of things. And even if you control for a lot of things, you're always going to miss something. You're going to always missing something. Whereas when you look at the gender gap, you have a country of ancestry fixed effects that's going to capture absolutely every institution in that country, whatever effect. So anything that affects men and women in the same way, any institution that affects men and women in the same way in the country of ancestry or in the host country is controlled for in the gender gap methodology, okay? And that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. So hopefully that's, but the different topic is, of course, policies and institutions matter and make a big impact. And, and if you look at the slides, I don't know if you're going to make them public, but the slides do acknowledge that there's different institutions that might target differentially men and women, and that also can have consequences. Okay.
Okay, thank you. I think the next two questions refer to the first paper, the intimate partner violence one. Do you consider in your IPV paper the reverse trend that has recently been observed where increasing gender equality increases IPV with perpetrators responding poorly to the backing of gender norms?
Okay, I'm not sure I follow the question.
Yeah, I think it refers to some papers that have shown that some partners may become more violent when the gender norm, the traditional gender norm is violated, or when the women go on to work. And
yes, okay, so here's a thing. If I take the data that we have, which is European countries, and I correlate IPV of the women with gender equality, the GGI in the host country, in the country they live, I find that more gender equality is associated with more IPV.
Okay.
But that's a correlation. Why? Because there I'm capturing not just the culture, the gender norms in the country, but I'm also capturing institutions. And in institutions that, in societies that are more gender equal and where the rules and the laws are there to protect more women, we're going to have much more women being vocal about being victim of gender violence and reporting it and recognizing that they're victim of gender violence. So that's true. Yes, but that's exactly what this methodology does. It allows one to isolate the effect of norms only and put aside institutions, right? So by just focusing on the GGI in the country of ancestry, now we're kind of removing any effect on institutions, because basically it's impossible that a woman from Mexico can be impacted by the institutions from Mexico if she lives in Denmark, right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of so I think one needs to be very careful on the results on more gender equality or more institutions empowering women, or even women more income, etc., and more domestic violence, because there you have a problem with measurement, and you have a problem also with the woman now no longer internalizes that it's okay for the husband to beat her, and she kind of complains, but she can also go to the police and complain, right? Because she trusts the system and trusts the society that they're going to listen to her. So
yes.
So that's why it's key to think about the identification strategy, because otherwise you might get correlations, and when you get correlations, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of confounding effects.
Okay, well, there are a couple more questions. I think we are going to keep, because we are 1 minute from the end of time, so I think we are going to keep them, and we'll either be put on the policy symposium this afternoon also to see if there are other questions, but otherwise I will pass them to you, and perhaps you can think about them. So now there is going to be a 10-minute break, and we reconvene for the rapid session at 9:15 using a separate Zoom link. I would like to take the opportunity to everyone to wish you a very inspiring and productive second and final day of the workshop. Thank you very much.